Welcome, everyone. I'd like to extend warm comradely greetings to all of you, as usual. This is our third webinar on digital activism in support of Cuban solidarity. Thank you for participating in this documentary screening panel discussion on the war on Cuba, part 3. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Saliha Zardad, and today again, I'll be facilitating the webinar. With me, I have the Secretary of Focus, Fatima Swartz, and she's just returned from a workshop and she had 15 minutes to set up. So our resident techie is definitely the right person to allow us to have a seamless discussion today. We have quite a few comrades that are showing solidarity. I would like to acknowledge you, especially Father Michael, the chairperson of Focus Western Cape, our speakers, William Gumede, Vicky, and Matsubani, and then a few familiar names and that I see here that has joined us. Welcome to all of you. So you know, of course, now that in terms of the Personal Information Act, that we need to disclose that this webinar is being recorded. It's live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. And the social media uptake, incidentally, of these webinars have actually been quite encouraging, with many views and many shares. I'm going to ask people to please continue to do this in support of the people of Cuba. We indicated earlier, I'm not sure if everybody heard, that you turn off your voice and video functions when not speaking, and that we respect the views of everybody. Okay, so today we're going to open the program with a 90-second video clip, message of support from Father Michael, the chairperson of Focus.
Are you going to go through the agenda first, or shall I just?
We can go through the agenda. Let me see. Okay, so we're going to start off with Father Michael, as indicated. Then I'm going to do an introduction, which, pardon me, just on the war on Cuba. And then we're going to introduce the speakers and have their contribution. So it's William Gumede, Vicky Ehrenstein Yatoivo, and Dr. Matsubani Mulomo. After that, we'll take questions or contributions from people and of those that are participating. And then we'll get final concluding comments and input from the speakers. And then Fatih will take us through some of the housekeeping towards the end. Okay, so we'll start off with the 90-second message of support from Father Michael.
Okay.
As a solidarity organization, we were founded
Fatih, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Is it very soft?
Yeah, it's a bit soft.
No sound, Fatima, as well.
Oh, no sound.
Yeah, I need to start it.
Let me just check my sound on my side. It's up. And I'll go back. And
my name is Father Michael.
That is as loud as it goes.
Okay. Society in Cape Town, South Africa. As a solidarity organization, we were founded to foster people-to-people relations between the people of South Africa and the people of Cuba. Also, we are committed to opposing the illegal and immoral United States blockade against Cuba. For many years, South Africans have been traveling to Cuba medicine. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was natural that our country would turn to Cuba to ask for help. The presence of the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade in South Africa for the last year has shown us practical internationalism. We are humbled and forever grateful that once more you were willing to risk your own lives to help save our lives. Cuba's response to the pandemic has shown the whole world Cuba's love for the human family. We are proud that our government has come out to endorse the nomination of the Henry Reeve Brigade to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. All of humanity has been confronted with the question of what is really important for the survival of the human species and of Mother Earth. All of the weapons of mass destruction and the arms trade has not helped defeat the pandemic. Cuban doctors have. Cuba's example of a society with decent health care and dignity for all inspires us to create a new world. Cuban people, loving people, we will never forget what you have done for us. Muchas gracias. Abrazos.
I'm sorry, that was the loudest I could go, eh?
That's fine, Fatih. Thank you. I think maybe we can say to people that if they want to watch the video, it is on our Facebook page.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, so I think Father Michael, in his message of support, he ended there and he said, Cuban people, loving people, we will never forget what you have done for us. Thank you very much. I've just translated the Spanish. But we'll see this, that sets the tone for today, and we'll also see this theme repeated by our speakers. So if we go on now, in terms of our program, to the actual screening, the War on Cuba mini-series, which exposes the damage US policies have had on Cuba's economy and communities. Just briefly, it was co-produced by Danny Glover and Oliver Stone as part of the media house Belly of the Beast, which looks at the war on Cuba is a mini series in 3 parts, which looks at and exposes the damage that the US-led blockade against Cuba has had on the Cuban community and economy. It also seeks to promote a so-called insider's perspective so as to counter the so-called parachute journalism, that of outsiders landing briefly, departing with misinformation. 2 weeks ago and last week, we met Liz Oliver Fernandez, a young Cuban journalist, and through her voice, we see how the blockade has impacted the lives of ordinary people. Specifically for episode 3, it explores Cuba's healthcare program and medical brigades, and we see doctors who served in Brazil, Bolivia, and Italy, and of course the ones who held it down in Cuba during COVID-19. Okay, Fatih, you can play the video now, the screening.
Just to say again that apparently not all the episodes are available to be downloaded because they get revenue from the ads. So sorry about that.
Upgrade to unlimited 5G from only $6.99 a month.
and lives. The United States has 60 times more COVID deaths per capita than we do here in Cuba. No me sorprende. Cuba has more doctors per person than any other country. We treat our doctors like war heroes, especially these days.
Estoy segura de que en Cuba vamos a estar bien. 100% confianza y seguridad de la medicina cubana. Y nosotros confiamos en ellos. Porque son los mejores médicos del mundo.
Since COVID began, every night at 9 p.m. we cheer for our doctors. Pero fuera de Cuba, todos no son aplausos.
In the last few years, our doctors have come under attack. Every morning, tens of thousands of doctors, nurses, and medical students take to the streets across Cuba. They are on the front lines of our fight against COVID. Talia Ruiz is a first-year medical student.
No me siento con miedo. Nosotros si nos cuidamos y tomamos las medidas necesarias tampoco tenemos por qué contagiarnos. Hay médicos que han ido y se han enfrentado directamente con la enfermedad y no se han contagiado, como por ejemplo mi papá. Hola papá.
Talia's father, Juan Jesus, is a family doctor who works at a small clinic next to their home. In March, he joined a group of Cuban doctors on a medical mission to Lombardy, Italy. At the time, Lombardy was the global epicenter of the pandemic.
Por el número de casos, desbordó los sistemas de salud. Ayudamos sobre todo a este personal médico que ya no podía ya con ese volumen de casos y salvamos unas cuantas vidas. Caminar hacia el acto de despedida, en todas las casas la gente salía y nos aplaudía. Esa fue la sensación más agradable que he sentido en mi vida. Por esas cosas que uno sale de misión.
It wasn't the first time Juan Jesus risked his life far from home. He's part of the Henry Reeve Brigade, Cuba's medical special forces.
Henry Reeve era un expedicionario norteamericano que vino a pelear en la guerra de 68 para Cuba contra los españoles. Se inauguró la brigada en el año 2005. Un huracán que se llamó Katrina, que acabó con Nueva Orleans, hubo una cantidad de muertos tremenda. Cuba se ofrece en mandar 100 médicos para trabajar conjuntamente con los médicos norteamericanos que estaban allí.
George W. Bush rejected Cuba's offer to help New Orleans. Since then, Juan Jesus has treated survivors of natural disasters and epidemics around the world. In 2014, he fought Ebola in Liberia, West Africa.
Nos decía en la calle, ¿no? Ustedes están locos, se van a morir todos allá. La epidemia de ébola es una enfermedad muy letal y vamos asustados.
¿Por qué someterse a ese tipo de condiciones?
Por el afán de sentirse útil, sentir que salvaste una vida. Cada vez que pienso en que es probable que no me hayan pagado mucho, yo nada más que me acuerdo de las caras de las personas que se salvaron, ¿entiendes? Nosotros teníamos un niñito que se le murió a la familia entera y nosotros éramos su único sustento. Usted sabe la alegría de verlo a él todos los días vivo. Eso es como si te pagaran mucho dinero.
Cuba's International Medical Program began in 1960 when it sent a health brigade to Chile in response to a deadly earthquake. Since then, Cuba has sent more than 400,000 medical personnel to 164 countries. For decades, Cuba's medical missions were purely humanitarian. The government didn't charge a penny. Today, Cuba still sends thousands of doctors to poor countries in Africa and Latin America at no cost. But in the last 20 years, Cuba has also begun charging wealthier countries. Under some of these deals, Cuban doctors receive about 25% of what the host governments pay. About 75% goes to the state. The money pays for free healthcare in Cuba. 30,000 Cuban healthcare workers now serve on missions in 59 countries.
There are two questions every single South African should ask themselves. Question number one,
For years, US officials and Florida politicians have vilified Cuba's medical missions. Since Donald Trump was elected, they've intensified their attacks.
Okay, so the allegation is that Cuban doctors are being sent around the world to work in different places. These Cuban medical missions, if you'll call them, are really just disguised human trafficking.
We've noticed how the regime in Havana has taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to continue its exploitation of Cuban medical workers.
This business of forced labor is the functional equivalent of modern-day slavery.
USAID offered $3 million in grants to investigate alleged rights violations of Cuban medical personnel. But the campaign against Cuba's international medical program had little impact until November 2018.
And the breaking news is the far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, has won Brazil's presidential race.
Dubbed the Donald Trump of the tropics.
With a history of making racist, misogynistic, and homophobic comments.
He also talks up dictatorship. President Trump tweeted about it this morning. We agreed that Brazil and the United States will work closely together on trade and military and everything else.
Bolsonaro wasted no time in forcing an end to Cuba's medical program in Brazil.
Eu jamais faria acordo com Cuba nesses termos. Isso é trabalho de escravo.
É difícil. After Bolsonaro's comments, Cuba sent its doctors in Brazil home. It was a big blow to Cuba's health system, which lost hundreds of millions of dollars in annual income. Cuba's doctors were also affected. In Cuba, you don't have to go far to see a doctor, porque en cada comunidad vive y trabaja uno. Mario Diaz is a family doctor. 2 years ago, he was in Rio de Janeiro when Bolsonaro won the election.
De esta vaquera ciudad nos recibieron muy bien, por la diferencia del trato que da el médico brasileño al médico cubano. Los tratamos como personas, como un igual, no es una mercancía. No es que yo lo atiendo para coger dinero. Nosotros caemos en zonas que médicos brasileños no quieren ir a trabajar. Zonas de pobreza y lugares incluso que nunca tuvieron un médico.
¿Cuánto gana un médico trabajando en Cuba?
Yo tengo un salario básico, que es de 1.740 pesos. Allá ganaba $700. Es verdad que el gobierno de nosotros, el sistema de salud, se quedaba con una parte de ese contrato. Pagaban por cada médico cubano 12.000 reales. Nosotros recibimos alrededor de 3.000. Pero lo invierte aquí en obras sociales, en la reparación de las instituciones de salud, en la compra de materia prima para producir medicamentos en nuestro país. No es que se lo coge el presidente. Tú lo miras desde el punto de vista personal, a lo mejor lo ves como injusto, pero tú piensas en algo más grande y ves que tiene un beneficio para el país. Hay un dicho aquí en Cuba que nosotros usamos que es que el ladrón piensa que todo el mundo es de su misma condición. Ellos piensan que todo el mundo gira alrededor del dinero nada más. Y no es así. Yo quise ser médico siempre. ¿Para qué? Para ayudar a la gente. Eso no es porque voy a ser rico. De hecho yo vivo aquí mismo donde trabajo. Yo me encuentro con mis vecinos en la cola de la tienda.
¿Dónde entra Estados Unidos en todo esto?
Bolsonaro siempre siguió la línea del presidente americano. A él le dicen el Trump latino. Estados Unidos quiere cortar esa entrada para ahogar la economía cubana, para tratar de lograr un cambio político aquí en la isla. ¿Entiendes? Cuando Cuba se retiró del programa, alrededor de 1.700 municipios quedaron de un golpe sin medio. Así. Yo tuve la experiencia de un paciente mío allá en Brasil, un señor de alrededor de 70 años, analfabeto. Y él fue, marcó consulta para ir a despedirse de mí.
Upgrade to unlimited 5G from only $6.99 a month.
We're excited about our newest member of the Dalco family, available at a pharmacy near you.
Lloró aquí en el hombro mío.
Millions of Brazilians in poor communities were left without health care. It was just the beginning. Ecuador's president became a Trump ally, and then, in November 2019, he expelled hundreds of Cuban doctors. That same month, a US-supported coup ousted Bolivian President Evo Morales. Bolivia's de facto government immediately took aim at the Cuban doctors.
Los falsos médicos cubanos.
Nos acusaba de que no éramos médicos, nos acusaba de bandidos.
Joandra Muro was head of the Cuban Medical Mission in Bolivia.
Amenazaban con quemar la casa de los médicos cubanos, a otros los llevaban al Interpol, a dos de nuestros compañeros los apuntaron con armas, revisaron a nuestras mujeres, algunas las desnudaron.
Cuando sucedió en Brasil, el argumento era de que los médicos cubanos eran víctimas, hay los pobres médicos cubanos que son esclavos del gobierno de Cuba. Sin embargo, el discurso respecto a Bolivia cambió. Ya no eran víctimas, sino que eran victimarios.
Siempre van a buscar algún argumento para llegar al mismo fin, que es desacreditar. En Bolivia no podían hablar del dinero que Cuba recibía. En Bolivia, cada colaborador recibía un excipiente de $800, pero era un pago directo al colaborador. A Cuba no le pagaban.
¿Qué usted cree que está detrás de todo esto?
Ya había una comunicación del propio gobierno de Estados Unidos de una agresión abierta y además financiada para atacar la colaboración médica cubana. El carro que estaba allí, frente a nuestra casa, era un carro de la Embajada Americana. ¿Qué hace un carro de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en el momento que nos están deteniendo a nosotros como médicos cubanos?
After Joandra returned to Havana, she became the head of TELAM, the biggest medical school in the world.
La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina es una escuela totalmente gratuita. Hemos graduado más de 30.000 jóvenes de 117 países. ¿Sí? Ya tenemos 198 graduados de los Estados Unidos. El mundo necesita médicos. Que no fuera solo mandando ayuda, mandando colaboración médica. Que qué importante sería que esos países tuvieran su propia formación de médicos. Esto nos aporta en un mundo donde es igual, en un mundo que hoy quizás no te brinda la posibilidad del propio lugar donde vives de formarte como médico.
In the face of the global pandemic, Cuba's international medical program has grown. The Henry Reeve Brigade has sent nearly 4,000 doctors and nurses to more than 30 countries to fight COVID. But the Cubans were still not welcome in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil.
In Bolivia, the healthcare system there has been overwhelmed by the coronavirus pandemic.
Hospitals are at breaking point. People aren't just dying in their cars, they're also dying on the street.
Ecuador is seeing one of the world's worst coronavirus outbreaks. Corpses wrapped in plastic and left on the sidewalk in Ecuador.
Brazil's infections are rocketing, particularly among the poor. They're digging thousands upon thousands of graves. Brazil now has the second highest number of cases and deaths in the world.
Even with so many doctors fighting COVID in other countries, Cuba has contained the pandemic at home.
Yo atiendo en esta zona 952 pacientes y no he tenido caso de COVID. El punto fundamental de que el COVID no haya sido una epidemia inmensa en Cuba ha sido la pesquisa y el aislamiento de contacto. Mi hija pesquisando, la pobrecita, subir y bajar escaleras no es nada grave, pero lo que le toca.
¿Qué edad tú tenías cuando tu papá se fue a la primera misión?
Cuando yo tenía 1 año ya estaba cumpliendo una misión. Es tu papá y quieres tenerlo aquí y sabes como que sientes que te falta algo. Con el pasar de los años vas entendiendo la situación, que es su propósito en esta vida. No es un médico simplemente cubano, es un médico del mundo. Mi sueño es ser un médico tan abnegado y sacrificado como lo es mi papá. Hay muchas campañas difamatorias, sobre todo de parte de los Estados Unidos, pero al final todo es mentira. Son gente con un corazón inmenso que aman lo que están haciendo.
¿Usted ha notado un cambio entre las actitudes del gobierno de los Estados Unidos con los médicos cubanos en los últimos años?
Hay una mayor utilidad respecto a las misiones médicas cubanas.
¿Por qué están haciendo eso?
Fácil. Es parte del bloqueo. La Henry Reeve es muy altruista, hace las misiones para servir a los demás, pero hay misiones que si eran remuneradas, que Cuba recibía dinero de esas misiones. Ese es el objetivo fundamental del decreto de los médicos cubanos. No porque le interese la cantidad de horas que trabajemos, sencillamente para privar al país de otra fuente más de dinero.
¿Acaso el gobierno de los Estados Unidos no tiene suficientes problemas que resolver para andar preocupándose por nosotros?
Some people say the blockade isn't a big deal. that our economic problems are only caused by our government or by socialism.
If that's true, ¿por qué no quitan el bloqueo?
Thank you, Fatih. Okay, so we can see that despite the human costs of the blockade that were highlighted again, specifically in the voice of Juan Yeses, one of the family doctor in Cuba, and he tells us why he does what he does. He wants to be a part of something bigger than himself. It also stems from an innate desire, he says, to do something good and just to see others smile. You know, he says that is enough for him. It gives him meaning and purpose. Okay, so I'll introduce the three speakers now, and then they'll also speak in the order that they've been introduced in. We'll start off with William Gumede. Okay, so William is an associate professor at the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand. He was convener of the course on public finance and economics for members of parliament in South Africa. And he taught a program on ethics for the British Commonwealth Parliament. He serves on a number of advisory boards, and he's a founder and executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation. He's author of a few #1 bestsellers, plus he wrote a number of introductions. For example, Mandela's No Easy Walk to Freedom. And he also wrote the introduction to the autobiography of Assata Shakur, the African-American civil rights leader who sought refuge in Cuba from the US government. He was asked to write the new introduction to Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela's 1991 book, How Far We Slaves Have Come. William has won a number of South African and international awards for activism, journalism, and writing. And what is little known is he wrote a children's book, A Kite's Flight, for which he also won an award. Today, William will speak to an area that is very close to his heart and that he's been researching for a number of years, and that is the issue of race and racism and how Cuba has dealt with these complex issues. Next, we're having Vicky Ehrenstein Yatoivo. She is a member of the Namibia-Cuba Friendship Association. There was a discussion earlier that she had with Father Michael, so I might be repeating a bit, but she's a lifelong activist in the struggle to end the US blockade of Cuba. She's an American by birth and a Namibian citizen, a lawyer by profession. She first became active in the United States movement in solidarity with Cuba in the 1970s. And when she moved to Namibia in 1991 to join her husband, the late Ndimbo Toivo Yatoivo, one of the great heroes of the Namibian people, she continued her solidarity activities in support of the people of Cuba. Comrade Vicky will speak on the strong bond of solidarity between Cuba and Namibia and what Cuba has done for Namibia. And then we have Dr. Matsubane Molomo. He was born at Mapela Hans in Limpopo. He was raised by a single parent who was a cleaner, and he was very active in sport from childhood and received in his own words, amazing support from community members. He started his schooling at Mapela, then moved to Mahwelereng to further his studies till grade 12 at Gojela High School. Post high school, he went to the University of Limpopo to study a Bachelor of Science, and after 6 months, he was offered an opportunity to study medicine at Cuba, sponsored by the South African Department of Health. So Dr. Molomo was studying in Cuba as part of the Nelson Mandela Fidel Castro Medical Collaboration Program, which was started in 1996. It's a collaboration between the two governments with the intention of improving South Africa's capacity in the health sector. His journey to Cuba was both in medical studies and leadership. A month after his arrival, he was selected. Oh, God.
Oh, what happened? Hello. I think there must have been some crisis where Saliha is. Shall we give her a minute to appear? If not, can we then call on William? If you could start with your presentation, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. What I want to do is to share the screen. I may have to get permission from you as the host because I'm
Okay.
if you could do that.
All right.
With Saliha.
So I've shared the screen. I'm just quickly going to go onto the line with Saliha to find out what happened to her. But you can share.
Okay, here we go. I just wanted to check with you. Would you be able to see this properly? Can you see the screen?
Anybody in the chat, if you can't, then please let us know.
If you can see it, and I assume everyone else can see it. Go ahead.
Yes, we can see it.
Lovely. Thank you again for inviting me. I was wondering what I'm going to talk about because there's so many things one can talk about. And I thought, it would be very good to talk about the lessons from Cuba, how they dealt with race. It's not often a topic in South Africa that we talk about, but I think there's really, really useful lessons from Cuba and how they dealt with racism. I think the very, very first, there is why would it be important to have a look at what Cuba done is that we say a legacy of colonialism and we say a legacy of slavery. In South Africa, we had apartheid also. And what a legacy of colonialism and slavery and apartheid means, it leaves a very deeply ingrained racism within institutions and social relations and everyday behavior. Now, this is very crucial if one wants to come out with solutions to deal with racism, is how does one deal long after the end of official racism, deal with, with a deeply ingrained racism within the institutions. And, institutions, I talk quite broadly, from organizations to, the families institution, to churches, political parties. These are all institutions. And in the social relations, how do we do it? It makes it much more complicated to deal with racism. Cuba, we've heard a lot about, Cuban solidarity and what Cuba has done for health. But Cuba has done more to combat racism than South Africa, Brazil, and the US. These are the three countries in the world where racism is allied to persistent race-based inequalities. And where, as I said, origins of racism in historical injustices against Black people. Now, countries such as South Africa and Cuba, because racism has a particularly deep legacy in the past, it is infused in the DNA of almost every institution long before the end of the formal racism and so on. And racist practices become so part and parcels of habits, routine, and social and professional interaction that it often is not even recognized as racism. So it makes it very difficult to tackle racism within that context. I mean, briefly, what is the discourse on racism in South Africa? In South African discourse, often persistent racial inequalities are often set, or rather, Blacks are often being blamed for being mostly poor. It's often justified in racist discourse because Blacks are allegedly being poor because of individual failure. Often a Black child in school who are talkative may be deemed as a problem, while a white child would be seen as confident. A Black child may be unconsciously overlooked for praise by a white teacher, but a white child would be routinely praised. Black South Africans are often who are seeking welfare or who are on welfare are often presumed to be scoundrels because they are Black. Or Blacks affected, say, for example, by HIV/AIDS will often be said they are infected because they are Black and more promiscuous. So that is the sort of some of the racist discourses. I mean, that is a really, in a very, very quick overview. Now, the history of racism in Cuba. I mean, in 1962, Cuba formally declared racism eradicated on the island. But interestingly, in 1986, the Cuban writer Pedro Civiat came out with a book called The Black Problem in Cuba and Its Definite Solution, where he said the reality was a little bit more complicated because of the historical legacy that I talked about at the beginning. The reality was complicated. And here I'm going to take on what was that complicated reality, because that complicated reality can also be compared to South Africa, and is also what will make in the future it very difficult to deal with racism in South Africa also. I mean, in both South Africa and Cuba, many whites denounce explicit racism, and often they personally reject racism and see racism generally as something of the past and as the society as post-racial. And then many well-meaning whites in both societies would often argue that color does not matter anymore, and they therefore dismiss delivered realities of their fellow Black compatriots. I mean, Joe Fegan, the US sociologist, describes such invisible racism as the assumption, often sometimes, of white morality and the assumption of a lack of morality in other groups, or the assumption that whiteness and emotions and cultural outlooks are the norm, and it believes that Western civilization and institutions as the only acceptable reference point, and the denial of the existence of racism in sort of, let's call it post-formal racism context. And although in both South Africa and Cuba, Blacks may have reached the top in government and politics and other sectors of society, this deeply ingrained, inherited institutional, social, and individual practices, which I talked about, often reproduce, makes racism often invisible to many. And to and in that context, two leading Cuban thinkers of race, they wrote, again in the late 1980s, they talk about residual racism. So despite all the efforts, formal efforts in Cuba, that there was still residual racism. And, you know, this is a very important lesson from a South African point of view in our own efforts to deal with racism. As I say, Cuba has done much more than the US and Brazil and South Africa to deal with racism, but there were still aspects, despite all of the successes, what is called residual racism by two leading Cuban scholars of race. Now, let's unpack the Cuban anti-racism policy, which was, for me, a very successful policy, despite, of course, you know, pockets of residual racism that persisted. But, you know, largely it was one of the most successful anti-racist policies introduced by any country in the world. In 1976, Cuba's constitution declared that discrimination based on race, color, or sex, or national origin as prohibited and punishable by law. It adopted an anti-racism strategy which combined outlawing official racial practices, tackling institutional racism, and also racism at the social levels. Its anti-racist policy focused really on a couple of pillars. The very first pillar was on introducing social equality through providing public services, access to education, health and housing, and opportunities to previously disadvantaged, no matter their color. And the Cuban leadership made talking about race in public a taboo subject. Cuba, we know, nationalized all private industries. And then what happened in terms of, you know, appointments, what we would call in South Africa affirmative action. Cuba had its own equivalent office of appointing, you know, blacks also to top leadership positions in the new nationalized industries. At the time, you know, of the beginning of sort of the ends of the Cuban Revolution, many of the Cuban Communist Party was mostly white. And often because Black Cubans were likely to be less educated at the time, it would almost naturally that whites were initially dominant in the senior positions of the new nationalized companies. And over the years, there were efforts now to diversify appointments to nationalize companies, and also dedicated attempts to bring blacks into senior positions in public office. Related to that policy was, in 1968, Cuban banned race-based exclusions of members of clubs and associations. It introduced rent control and granted ownership of rented housing to occupants. Now, this is all to, you know, to bring what I said earlier on social equality. So the idea really, you know, the argument was, if one brings social and economic equality, it is one way at least to partially deal, you know, with a race issue. It made education and healthcare free. And over time, race-based economic inequalities were reduced because of the access now to land and to housing and to education for, you know, for Black Cubans also. Now, despite of a 3 decades attempt from the 1960s to deal with racism, the 1985 Communist Party conference, called its third Congress, considered that there was still disproportionately too few Blacks as well as women, of course, in youth, in professional and leadership and management positions in Cuba. So despite at the time, so by 1985, Cuba had, as I say, the most successful anti-racism policies of any of the diverse countries, in particular countries with histories of discrimination. And still, even though it was very successful in 1985, there was still disproportionately too few Blacks in senior professional and leadership and management positions. The Cuban government then launched a new initiative to increase the speed of advancement of disadvantaged groups. Now, the lessons from Cuba for us is that to deal with racism, affirmative action, redistribution, and welfare support is crucial to level the playing field. So tackling racism without leveling the playing field, it is impossible. I mean, the second lesson from the Cuban response is to outlaw racist behavior and to punish racists. And then for me, the third lesson from the Cuban experience is social equality, to have social equality in society, and to work and to build on social equality. And when I talk about social equality, is to bring equality in terms of access to opportunities, access to material possessions, access to education, access to healthcare. And through that, equality becomes then a very, very important avenue to deal with racism. And then to regularly review over periods of how far society has moved towards racial equality. So consistently, but as a Communist Party over frequently, they've made assessments to look at society, surveys, to look at racial equality and the state of progress. And then greater integration of all races at all levels of society is crucial. Incidents of racism that comes up must be firmly dealt with if you look at the Cuban examples. Greater awareness in Cuba, I think perhaps one of the things that's overlooked is the awareness from the beginning of the systemic nature of racism. I mean, I think the Cuban leadership did not assume that at the end of the Cuban Revolution, there would be racism would automatically disappear. There was an awareness of the systemic nature of it. And there was also awareness of the multiple forms of racism and the invisibility of racism, and then how to respond to that invisibility of racism in institutions, social spaces, and social relations. And then a core part of the Cuban response has been education about racism in school, workplace, communities, and in all other social spaces. And lastly, Cuba correctly pursued a strategy of tackling inherited racial inequality in excess of services, opportunities, skills, assets, as a very crucial part of dealing with racism. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, William. And I apologize for disappearing there briefly. Thank you for starting. Yes, there's quite a lot in what you've given us. I think maybe just to summarize, you referred to residual racism that's still lingering in Cuba. You spoke about Cuba, or you highlighted Cuba's successful anti-racist policy, and you referenced 1985 as with Cuba having the most successful policy of anti-racism, but with Blacks still being underrepresented. And then you went into detail about lessons for us. So thanks very much for that, William. I'm sure there'll be questions for you later on. Okay, so now we're going to go on to Comrade Vicky from Namibia. Comrade Vicky, we look forward to your input today. You can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you. It's not easy to encapsulate in a few minutes what Cuba means to the people of Namibia. Cuba has an almost magic meaning in Namibia. A large portion of the Namibian population knows something about Cuba. Our relationship is rooted in bloodshed together for the liberation of Namibia, concrete and consistent international solidarity, and a shared commitment to build a better world that puts the well-being of people first. It's truly a relationship of love and comradeship. I was reminded just yesterday when I went to the home of someone very prominent, somebody who had passed away, and there I saw a photo of him with the Cuban Five, all wearing SWAPO election scarves. Now, how did this relationship start? First, there was the solidarity, let us say, political and in the trenches. Time does not permit me to go into this history. I have written it down, but I could see I really have to cut my presentation short. Let us just say that the independent Angola gave refuge to SWAPO exiles and to SWAPO military combatants. And South Africa was invaded Angola in 1975 and repeatedly sent greater and greater military forces into Angola. It was also supporting the destabilization of the MPLA government through local proxies. And by the way, so was the US. Now, in 1978, on the 4th of April, there was a massive South African air raid on Kasinga refugee camp. Over 600 Namibians were killed, mainly women and children, and they were buried in a mass grave. When this attack was going on, the Cubans at a base about 15 kilometers away, they could see what was happening from the sky. They came to the rescue, or they came to try to rescue the Namibians. And in the course of this, 16 Cubans died, mainly from landmines. But probably their arrival may have saved the lives of more Namibians who might have been killed. There were also hundreds and hundreds who were wounded. Now, Cuba, as an act of solidarity, offered a place of refuge for Namibian children who survived the Kasinga massacre. 601 Namibian children were airlifted to Cuba and accommodated in their own facility on the Isle of Youth. They had their own school with Namibian and Cuban teachers. And these children stayed there until Namibia's independence. Each year thereafter, Cuba took additional students from Namibia, from exiled young people from Namibian camps, and accommodated them at the Isle of Youth. And they also took Namibians whom they sent to technical schools and universities. They treated these children like their own children. And I don't know the number, but it's more than 1,000 Namibians had a very significant part of their upbringing in Cuba. Now, Cuba and the People's Liberation Army and FAPLA, the MPLA military wing, collaborated together until Namibia achieved independence. Tens and tens of thousands of Namibians who were in exile came to see Cubans as their comrades, their brothers, and their sisters. And that feeling among those people continues today. And you can imagine the multiplier effect. When you had Namibians who grew up in Cuba, you have all of these people who had something to do with Cuba. Now, that has a big multiplier effect considering that Namibia has a population of under 2 million. Official relations were established on the day of independence and many bilateral agreements were signed. Over the years, there have been 35 bilateral agreements between Namibia and Cuba, including technical assistance in health, trade cooperation, education, sports, provision of pharmaceuticals, town planning, ports, transport, culture, secondment of construction personnel, meteorology, agriculture, geology. 1,432 Cuban doctors, many of whom were specialists, have served in underserved areas of Namibia over the years. Now, for many years, there was minimal cost for this aid on Namibia's side. The blockade has affected this. It has affected us because Cuba cannot afford to provide these services for free. And there are many ambitious plans. There are ambitious plans on the drawing board that have had to be put on hold, not just because of the blockade, but because of COVID-19 and its economic impact on Namibia and on Cuba. At present, there are 88 health professionals, 21 construction experts, 4 fisheries experts, and 3 sports personnel in Namibia. And over the years, many hundreds of Namibians have studied in Cuba on Cuban scholarships, especially in the field of medicine, but also architects, engineers, and sports professionals. Now, with the blockade, Namibia is paying, I would add, paying at a very modest cost. There are presently 250 Namibians in Cuba studying medicine and dentistry. Now, the relationship, when you think of when you need something, as was said previously, when you're in need, you ask a friend. Our president, Hage Geingob, when he came into office, turned to Cuba and asked for help in setting up a food bank to feed many people who were suffering in food poverty. And he specifically asked for a Cuban diplomat who was the person who had taken the children to Kasinga. he asked him to come and help to set up the street committees in this food bank program. Cuba agreed, and this Comrade Dalmau and his wife came to Namibia and spent several years working with the food bank program. Now, political support. Namibia, in many international, regional, sub-regional forums, has been the leader in tabling resolutions against the blockade of Cuba. There has been considerable people-to-people solidarity, but I say before I get into that, even our opposition parties in Namibia, they support resolutions on solidarity with Cuba. They understand the relationship and what Cuba has done for Namibia. Now, in Namibia, there's a Namibia-Cuban Friendship Association. There was a committee to free the Cuban Five. There was parliamentarians to free the Cuban Five. And there is a very, very strong committee of Kasinga survivors who play a very special role in our society. First of all, and they learned this in Cuba, they take care of each other. When they make contributions, when someone dies, when someone is sick, they're involved in many, let us say, social welfare, mutual support activities. But they are also, because they grew up in Cuba, they are committed patriots in this country. You will not find them being the most famous people or the ones who are getting the biggest tenders, but you will find them making solid, dedicated contributions to our nation's development. And they also are an important core of our solidarity movement. Now, in the day-to-day life of Namibians, our largest informal settlement in Windhoek is named Havana. There is a Fidel Castro kindergarten in Windhoek, a Fidel Castro primary school. There's a Fidel Castro street in the center of Windhoek. And when Fidel Castro died, there was an outpouring of grief.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
When Fidel Castro passed away, there were
Fidel Castro died the 25th of November 2016 at age 90 in Havana.
Something is happening here on my computer. Sorry, I'm going to try to do something.
Yes.
I'm getting, what is this called? Sorry, is answering questions for me. Anyway, look, what I want to say.
Okay, it's not from my side.
Not wanting to take up a lot more time. Many Cubans have come to Namibia. We've had cultural exchanges, experts, family members of the Cuban Five. Namibia was, we vied to be the first country that the Cuban Five visited when they got out of jail. So there's a very personal feeling on the part of many Namibians towards Cuba. But I want to say that there's also an understanding of what the blockade and the efforts to discredit and weaken Cuba mean to Namibia. Cuba to us is a country that has asserted its sovereignty. It's decided it is going to develop itself as it sees fit. And we know, and I think it's understood among at least a certain sector of our population, that our future is tied in to the future of Cuba. Not only our future, but the future of other countries in Africa or even in the world who want to make their own decisions and decide what is best, how they will develop their country. So in brief, that's what Cuba means to Namibia.
Thank you so much, Vicky. In the weeks in the past 2 weeks leading up to today, I know we had the opportunity to talk about the Kasinga massacre, and thank you for bringing that here today in such vivid detail. Yes, thank you also for giving us a historical overview of the relationship between Cuba and Namibia, as well as focusing on the current relationship. For a small country or a country with a population of 2.5 million, you're certainly involved in many solidarity activities with Cuba, and we wish to acknowledge you for that. I'm sure there'll be questions later on. So earlier I was interrupted when I introduced the good doctor. So I'll just end briefly to do him justice, and then he can start his presentation. So I'm not sure exactly where I ended, but I think I said his journey to Cuba was both in medical studies and leadership. And a month after his arrival, he was selected as a DSG of the South African SRC. And a year later, he became president of Elam Latin School of Medicine in Cuba. This was also referenced in the documentary earlier. And this is where he learned so much about the relationship between the United States and Cuba. In 2018, he completed his studies and returned to South Africa to finish his studies at the University of Pretoria. He's currently a medical intern at Leratong Hospital in Krugersdorp, and he's an active member of an MPO named La Lutz World. Dr. Malomo, you'll share now with us, please, your experiences in Cuba.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone.
And Matsubane, just remember to be a bit closer to the mic.
Is it much better now?
It's better, yes, thanks.
Thank you. When one could ask Matsubane, give us an experience about Cuba, it can actually take a year, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. My experience in Cuba, it was both as a medical student in terms of medicine and leadership skills that we have learned so much from Cuban people. And as a student, I was more attracted to the kind of passion Cuban lecturers have. We arrived in Cuba, we couldn't speak Spanish, and the good thing is that they could not speak English because it was going to delay our learning progress. By that, they were very patient with us. They understood that we are coming from South Africa with 11 official languages. And they taught us from ABC to Z. And we've learned so much. And the integration between the students and the employees in all our institutions, it was amazing. We got to learn Spanish out of our classes. Most interestingly, it was actually the amount of Spanish that we have learned to date. I would say the contribution, it was from the employees. Father Michael, he knows one story that I once shared with him, that most of my Spanish, it was actually from, I was taught by a cleaner. And to date, I still appreciate his efforts, because if it was not him, possibly I was going to repeat my Spanish class as I arrived late. But when we go deeper into the experience back in Cuba, their curriculum, their medical curriculum, it speaks for itself. It's a primary healthcare curriculum. We start our practicals at an early stage. In South Africa, practicals are started from towards the end of third year to fourth year. In Cuba, our practicals, we started practicals on our first year of medical school. So that on itself, it has advanced us to understand, the basic elements of primary health care. And what you have seen on the video is not something that they are trying to publish out there. I've experienced it. We used to go door to door. We used to visit elderly people because they cannot walk. Some they can walk, but we'll still go to their houses and give them information about health. That on itself, it was the best experience one could get. And when we talk of, because I can talk more about health, but I'm trying to divide the two. When you talk more of leadership in Cuba, the first thing above all is the patriotism that the Cuban people have. We all know that the United States of America is trying by all means to head Cuba economically. And I am proud of Cuban people. And if some of them they are listening, I need them to know that we are proud of you, irrespective of the strict blockage, very hard blockage. Cuba still excel. COVID-19, it has revealed that Cuba can do well. We need the American people to understand that this blockage, they must just end it. It must be the end of it if they are interested in growing this world. We will never grow the world while we are pressurizing Cuba, because Cuba is, when you talk of medicine, I would say is the primary station where one could learn a lot. Even the Americans, as much as they can deny it, but they can learn so much from the Cuban people. And I was also interested with their national programs. I won't mention all of them, but the famous one, 1st of May, International Workers' Day. That's when you get to understand the level of unity. And that's when you will get to understand how the Cuban people understand their culture, their tradition. They come out in numbers. As a student, I was shocked the first time when I attended 1st of May. It was packed. They wake up 3 a.m. in the morning. They are already in the streets to celebrate this remarkable day. And the respect from the senior leaders is at another level. When I was the president at Elam, every time I could feel that I received the amount of respect that in South Africa, it doesn't happen frequently. They listen, they guide you. They are more than leaders, they are parents as well. So it was a journey that to date, I can confirm that if one would say, let's go to Cuba, I would stop everything and go, because Cuba is my second home. And the lessons that we learned, as medical students, we have learned so much in terms of academically and culturally, tradition and leadership. When I arrived in South Africa with a group of 800 plus South Africans, we made a promise to our government that we will do our best to better the system of South Africa. And I am proud to confirm today that when they spoke about La Luz World. La Luz World is an NPO that is currently running in South Africa, and majority of the members, they are Cuban trained. During the beginning of COVID-19 in South Africa, we went to townships and do what we are good at, which we call it pesquisa. Pesquisa is when you go to your communities, educating people of whatever conditions that you love to. But in our case, we went to Mokopane in Limpopo, And we educated people about COVID-19 before we even had a first case in South Africa. And that's when you talk of primary healthcare. Yes, the government was focusing on big institutions like your big stores, but we went to the communities and had intervention with the Pakistanis, because Pakistanis, they were not even aware of COVID-19. They did not even understand what is a sanitizer. So that's where our focus was. And I'm proud to say young people that went to Cuba, supported by our government and the long relationship that between Cuba and South Africa, we made it. The program was amazing. And the very same program is because of we studied in Cuba. So the lessons were many, but that what I've just mentioned, it was amongst all our lessons. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malomo. Thank you for sharing your insights on leadership and health gained from Cuba. You learned Spanish from a cleaner. I need to learn Spanish from you. Thank you for highlighting primary health care, which distinguishes Cuban medical health care. And you also referred to the patriotism of the Cuban people. I'd like now to open up the discussion to anybody who would like to either make a contribution or pose a question to the panel. You can raise your hand. Let me see if there's anything on the chat.
There's comments in the chat. I don't know if
okay,
Habiba would like to say something or Ansaf would like to say something.
Habiba or Ansaf, would you like to say something? Otherwise, is there anybody else? Ansaf, maybe I'll just, where are you?
Saliha.
Ansaf, maybe I'll just, where are you?
Saliha.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll and comment it's to William, and maybe he can have a response. Let's read it here. South Africa has its blueprints. This is now on racism in place, the Constitution, the Employment Equity Act, and so on, that support punitive measures amongst others. What do you think are the challenges with practically realizing enshrined rights within our current context of increasing poverty and inequality? Professor Gumede, do you have a response?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think that really the very first thing about our constitution is we must make it alive and laws alive. And there's our first challenge. It's not only in racism, but, across with other issues also, is that, and unless we give life to it beyond just the formal writing in the constitution, we have to give life to it. Secondly, it is going to be very important, like in the Cuban example, that we bring in quality service delivery to people who've been disadvantaged, on racist grounds in the pre-1994, that Black South Africans do get quality public services, health, education, and so on. So, because we failed at that, we also failed to deal with racism effectively. So, and then, some of the policies like Black economic empowerment and so on, and affirmative action, that were supposed to help with redress. Unfortunately, often we failed both in the public sector and often also in the private sector. So our failure has been, we've got a formal policies, but it's on paper, but it's often not adhered to or implemented on the one hand. And then secondly, our failure in the post-1994 to deal with redress, economic redress, equitable education, equitable healthcare, and so on. So what do we do? It is to hold not only government, to hold, of course, firstly, government accountable. So it would be civil society, ordinary citizens to do that, but it also is to hold business accountable, to play their part, and also for citizens to become much more active in demanding their rights, whether it is right on the democracy side or right on the delivery side, public service delivery side, or right on the economic side. And because we haven't done that, we've got all of the rules, we've got all of the laws, got all of the policies, but the state hasn't delivered. Then we have citizens who hasn't been active in demanding their rights and demanding that the Equity Act and all of the laws are implemented properly. So I think those are the challenges that we have to deal with.
Thank you, William. Thank you for that response. For Dr. Malomo, there's I don't know if it's a question, I'm going to read through it, but a comment from Habiba. She says, to all the speakers, brilliant input, esteemed humans, I appreciate you. And then she said she was especially happy to hear from Dr. Malomo, as she's been craving to hear this kind of experience from a young person schooled in Cuba. She says he makes the argument for why the world needed the Henry Reed Brigade. And she says Cuba's medical teachings stand apart as its orientation is primary healthcare as opposed to tertiary healthcare. And this is what the world needs to prevent and cure COVID. Okay. Yes. Do you want to comment on that, Dr. Malomo?
Briefly, I would say, I think South Africa is in a stage where we are ready to use a different approach, like invest more into primary health care. I am already in the system, and I've realized that because of the lack of primary health care, there are so many patients that we receive at a tertiary health care that we're not even necessarily needing our attention at the tertiary health care. So if we can enforce our clinics, any level of primary health care in South Africa is a disaster. So it's our job. We cannot always wait for government to intervene, but it's also our job as young people, getting support from people like Father Michael Lepsley and everyone around. We believe that it's possible to change the whole system and get more attention to our primary health care. There's more to be done. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just maybe to say to Habiba, if she wants to hear more from Dr. Malomo, he's done a number of interviews that are available online, if you just key in his name. Marcus, you have your video up and your hand waving. Please go for it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, Saliha. That's a wonderful intervention and program that Focus has organized. I've been a member of Focus for many years, but I think we very seldom, and I've been a part of many of these discussions, what doesn't always come out clearly is why, or sometimes the question is not asked. Why is it that Cuba, in every sphere of human endeavor, is tops in the world, whether it's sports, or culture, whatever? And although it's under this very terrible blockade, it is still able to survive. Now, why is that so? All these wonderful acts of solidarity, and by the way, very little goes back to Cuba from countries that have enjoyed for many years Cuban support. We need to ask, why is that so? Because in 1959, the Cuban Revolution took over every resource on that island and put it at the disposal of the people of Cuba. The land, the factories, the human resources, everything. In fact, it's part of Cuba's constitution now. It is a socialist society. And I think we need to ask that. And every single member of government is a servant of the people of Cuba. And the most important servant was Fidel. No street is named after him, by the way. There's no photo hanging in any office. I was in Cuba in 1990. There's no, 94, sorry. All this hero worshiping. Today, South Africa is still very much a capitalist country. And this government is known for looting. In fact, Ace Magashule today is to stand accused of stealing people's money that was meant for housing. So I think we need to ask, like the comrade there, speaks about primary health. It's the most important. In fact, many years ago, as I was involved in the civic, people were demanding clinics, not big hospitals. And we've had examples from China, barefoot doctors and all that, Tanzania. So I really think we need to ask what needs to be done besides all the other things that people are doing. We also need to understand why is Cuba, for example, the island of youth. Many years ago, when I was with many comrades, we dreamt one day Robben Island would one day become the equivalent of Cuba's island of youth. Besides the 600 children from Namibia, when the Soviet Union experienced the Chernobyl crisis, explosion, Cuba took on 10,000 Cuban Soviet children from the Soviet Union. And it came from resources that the Cuban people put at their disposal. And so we need to also ask our own government and other people, how much do we give back? How many people from other countries have studied in South Africa at the cost of our own government? I would like to hear that. Studied here. Yeah, so I think the question is, I'm sorry, I'm taking a bit of time. We need to ask ourselves, why is it that Cuba is the leading light when it comes to international solidarity, and it comes from people's consciousness? Now, the racism that William spoke about, I know it's taken a difficult, but the resource, every single child of Cuba, every human being, in fact, Cuba has the highest adult literacy in the world because they've been at school, every single person. They don't queue for food. I mean, they queue because they are rationing, because of the blockade. It's not because, in fact, Cuba is also, in my last point, Havana is the world's #1 urban city in the world. number one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. An absolutely critical question, which we will take forward in our deliberations, in focus, and in other structures. I'm just going to, because of the interest of time, I'm going to just look for any last questions that anybody has. Otherwise, I'm going to ask the speakers just for 1 minute each to sum up what they would like to leave, what message would they like to leave for us today in this webinar. So I'll start with Vicky. Comrade Vicky.
Yeah, I'm trying. Just a minute. I guess the message that I would like to leave is the struggle continues. And we must be consistent. I think that it's important, yes, that we also expose our people more to answer the question that was asked by Marcus. It's coming up now in Namibia. Even our president, SWAPO, adopted some clause about it was going to pursue socialism with Namibian characteristics. And our president, who was saying he thinks maybe the young people didn't think this through when they passed this resolution, he said, why is it that when Cuba is attacked, when you have the blockade, if you people are so revolutionary, why aren't you defending them? We just have to continue. And I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this exchange.
Thank you so much, Comrade Vicky. We take that to heart. Matsubane, would you like to give your input, your concluding 1 minute remark?
Thank you very much for allowing me to participate. It was great to hear different views and different experiences from different people. But at the moment, I'll challenge the Friends with Cuba organization in South Africa that as a young medical doctor, I will definitely forward to you guys our approach to primary health care. And in our next visit to our communities, it will be an honor to have you guys around so that we don't only talk about these issues, you can also experience them yourselves. So I will definitely send it to you, and I'm looking forward to participate in more events. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, William.
Thank you. I think my last one was just to respond to Marcus. Why have the Cubans remained very much in solidarity with other communities and has not gone away? I think perhaps the very first thing that has happened, because, Cuba, when they were really under pressure, they got a lot of help and solidarity from the old Soviet Union bloc and so on. And I think, that sense of solidarity that they got, they received, and then the commitment to give after they've received had become almost part of the national psyche of the country. And from us in South Africa, we've received the apartheid struggle from so many others around the world. Unfortunately, it does appear that, we haven't built in the last 3 decades, almost a culture or psyche of giving in return, giving to others outside our borders, but also giving to others just around in our own communities. That is gone. And for me, that's the important thing. And then the second thing is just in terms of, building of that equality, quality public services to everyone, skills, education, and health within the country. And again, if you look in a South African context, learning from Cuba, we did not do that. If you look at our public health system, if you look at our public education system, if we have followed the example of Cuba of building on human development, education, skills, a housing program, the 30 years so far would not have been wasted. We would have had now a kind of legacy of human development that Cuba had. And I think if we can take those lessons, the lesson of solidarity, that solidarity not, solidarity to the people in your own community, in your own families, but also solidarity outside to others, which unfortunately, of course, in the rhetoric, we're full of rhetoric in South Africa, but really in terms of doing it, in terms of action, we fall very fast short, and that is the lesson for me from Cuba that we should, as South Africans, take up.
Thank you, William. Yes, we need to focus on lessons learned from
Maybe you should put off your
Cuba.
visual.
Party, do you have the announcements?
Yeah. No, yeah, sorry if you could. So there is a couple of announcements that I would like to make. The first one is to ask people that as we might know that there are 331 million people in the US. We know this, right? And then there are in Cuba 11 million, a bit over 11 million people. And of course, this is the giant that is waging this relentless blockade against such a very small country, while they are such really a giant in the region in terms of not just how many people, but also numbers. But because of this really terrible blockade, it's been very difficult for the Cuban people to obtain the medical equipment and stuff that they need to be able to do the work that they do. There's a request out from the South African Cubans living in South Africa for donations to assist with the vaccination of the 11.3 million people in Cuba. So we are asking people to please make a donation. If you are interested, if you're not on our mailing list, we can send you the banking details. And if we could do it before the end of the month, that would really be much appreciated. So that's the one request that we're asking from people, in which we can, in a practical way, support the Cuban solidarity. The other one that we are looking at is that we are asking people. There's a global campaign in terms of Unblock Cuba, which is happening, and so we are asking people to join on Sunday, the 30th of May, in the afternoon, a Unblock Cuba motorcade. Now, these motorcades are happening all over. It's a global campaign. So it happens in Cuba, in the US, in Canada, other African countries, European countries, and so on. And we are in the process of putting together the motorcade for Cape Town, for first one, for the end of this month. So we are asking people to watch our Facebook page, and we'll also send a notice out onto our mailing list. So please keep an eye out for that. Please participate. Please show up. I think as part of solidarity is for people to be able to see that there is a support, not just in words, but also in action. So for me, from now, at this point in time, that's all from me. Sorry.
Thank you, Fatima. I think we're well over our time, so I'm just going to end off with a vote of thanks. Thanking all of you for attending today and extending and reinforcing our commitment to Cuban solidarity. To the Focus Western Cape comrades, especially comrades Father Michael, Secretary Fatima, Ansaf and Marcus. Thank you for your input. And then, of course, our panel, William, Vicky, and Matsubani, who shared their thought-provoking insights and very real personal experiences. Thank you for your perspective. Thank you for your time. It is much appreciated. I'd like to leave you with the words of another African giant, Samora Machel, who said, solidarity, and I quote, solidarity is not an act of charity, but it is mutual aid between forces fighting for the same objective, unquote. Long live friendship between Africa and Cuba. Long live. Amandla. Thank you, everybody. And we'll continue our digital activism in one form or the other, perhaps even taking forward Marcus's input towards the end.
Okay.
Have a nice afternoon.
And thank you, Saliha, for your excellent facilitation and putting the series together. Thank you. Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Muchas.
All right.